sound, image, right? So, and this is Bart's version, is that what this means is that meaning is structurally indeterminate. It can never stop. This will explain why, for instance, after 500 years of people doing readings of Shakespeare, we still have new ones. Right? Not because we're smarter and we're fine. I mean, this is how everyone will argue. I mean, everyone will be like, well, those guys are fucking morons. My version is smarter, you know? And not because we're smarter, because of the structure of how language operates. As a process of infinite deferral, never present. Right? Meaning is never there. It's always just around the corner. I always think this is like, this you should think of as the X-Files. The truth is out there. Tune in next week. Right? The promise that just around the corner, it's going to be there. Because it will. But it's the next corner. Right? But it's perpetually the next corner. It's this sort of infinite play. Okay. So, erased arbitrary and conventional, but let's pretend like they're still written up there. So when I hit the board, we all say arbitrary and conventional. So now this makes sense in terms of language, right? We understand signifiers, signifieds, and their relationship and what this does to reading, and it makes for like this infinite, for Barthes, this infinite jouissance of language. But imagine that for the word sign we use the category woman. You now have the basis for much theoretical feminism. Signifiers and signify. What is the meaning of woman? Right? What are the arbitrary and conventional ways in which this sign has been allowed to circulate in a signifying economy? Class, race, gender. I mean, so, and this is what Saussure says. Saussure says, I'm offering you a model for studying linguistics, but this model could be generalized to every area of study. And that is what happens. So the meaning of woman is not something that is set in stone, and it is not something that one can read off just from the signifier, from the presentation. Right? One has to analyze the arbitrary and conventional structure in which these signifiers operate. Suddenly you've got, theoretical feminism. Right? And this is for Levi-Strauss's case. It's like let's use this signification as the model for thinking about the function of myth in Borneo, I don't know, culture. What has happened here with the introduction of the sign is that the center has been displaced. Here, there was a clear center, the idea. It is what governed the whole operation of communication and representational language. Here, it's gone. What one has now is, like I said, infinite chains. I mean, you just represent it like this. Ad infinitum. Infinite chains of signification. Deferred presence. Woman isn't anything, per se. Right? This is an essentialism. This is a constructionism. To use the parlance of our times. Okay. We got it? Structuralist linguistics. Why we can use it to study anything whatsoever. Semiotics. Have you guys heard of semiotics? That is Saussure applied to cultural stuff. Things don't have meanings in and of themselves, intrinsically. Life has no meaning. Speaking very precisely. Right. Are we in pain yet? We should at least discuss one of the Derridas before we take a break, shouldn't we? Structure's not in play. I mean, seriously. That's just unacceptable. It's disgusting. I'm going to have someone, I'm going to have a towel boy.
I got one in my office.
It's like, we'll call time out, someone come up here and spray water in my mouth. All right, so like I said, this is an essay that a talk that he gives at the Hopkins conference. And this is one of the, I think, Stairway to Heaven. So, let's just skip over to the third page. So, something has happened in the history of structure. Structure has historically had a center. The notion of that center has always been not subject to the play that it enables. So that is to say, a center is necessary in order to create a notion of structure, but the center traditionally is not subject to the same laws of the play that it enables. Let's take an example. God is not, God produced, this is one version of it. You could also say nature. It doesn't matter. Or the human, it doesn't matter. But God would be the origin, the arche term of all that is. And so, for instance, God creates natural laws, and natural laws allow a whole lot of shit to happen. A lot of play is enabled by natural laws. But God is not, therefore, subject to those laws as the creator of them. So he is both the center of the structure and absent from that structure itself. Does that make sense? So he's both part of and absent from. And so the claim here is that the history of structure has always required some concept of a center. And I think origin is a much more easy word to understand than center in this case. So like there's an origin, a presumed origin, God, nature, man, spirit, whatever. And the history of the West has been, as Derrida says, the history of the substitution of centers for centers. Right? So humanism is not the elision of structure. It is the replacement of God as the center with man as the center. Reason. So, on to page 3. The event that's a rupture, though, occurs when the structurality of structure begins to be thought. In other words, when people start paying attention to this fact, to this constitution. After which, it becomes difficult to imagine that that center functions the way that it did. It's hard to take seriously the notion of a structure where the center is both present and absent. It seems like a problem. So the very structuredness of structure becomes a question. That's the event that he's marking. One could point to Saussure. He said, what would you... This was the moment when language invaded the universal problematic. The moment when, in the absence of a center or origin, everything became discourse, provided that we could agree on this word. That is to say, a system in which the central signified, the original or transcendental signified, is never absolutely present outside of a system of differences. The absence of the transcendental signified extends the domain in the play of signification indefinitely. That's what we've just mapped out with Saussure. Okay? But it doesn't start with Saussure. It says, where and how do we situate? When did this happen? And he's like, well, of course it would be too naive to say starts 1912. But he said, look, there's a couple of names. We would have to cite Nietzsche's critique of metaphysics, the critique of the concepts of being and truth, for which is substituted play, interpretation, and sign. The Freudian critique of self-presence, right? So we don't recognize how revolutionary Freud's critiques are. And how much the idea that most of, or at least a significant portion of your thinking is just not fucking available to you is an incredibly revolutionary idea that changes how you think about, for instance, rationality and its importance. So we live in an era in which that insight, the existence of subconscious or unconscious, is simply presumed. Most of human history didn't. So that makes something of a difference. I'll do the same homage to Nietzsche and Heidegger at some other point. That was my Freud one. So Freud's critique of self-presence, the critique of consciousness, of the subject, of self-identity, or more radically, Heidegger's destruction of metaphysics, ontotheology, the determination of being as presence. Okay. All of these destructive discourses, so these are all negative, these are all critiques, all of these destructive discourses and all their analogs are trapped in a kind of circle. This is on the bottom of 280, and this is the crucial part. But this circle is unique. So we've got a circle. It's a unique circle. It describes the form of the relation between the history of metaphysics and the destruction of the history of metaphysics. That's to say, there's no sense in doing without the concepts of metaphysics in order to shape metaphysics. We have no language, no syntax, no lexicon, which is foreign to this history. We can pronounce not a single destructive proposition which hasn't already had to slip into the form, the logic, and the postulates of precisely what it seeks to contest. To take one example from many, the metaphysics of present is shaken with the help of the concept of the sign, as we've seen. But as he'll analyze, he'll go down in the next half page and say, but actually, the notion of sign, signifier and signified, thought, right? So idea, sensory, that's a traditional metaphysical concept. In other words, what you have in this event, the entrance of language that one sees in Nietzsche, Heidegger, Freud, and others, basically early 20th century kind of critique of humanism, metaphysics, etc. Or let's include in this patriarchy, right? This is the same problem feminism produces, which is you cannot articulate a critique of patriarchy that doesn't already utilize the terminology, the concepts, the history of patriarchy. Okay? So you can't do without it. So you're in here, this is a circle. And it's a circle of a unique type. The circle of the existence of a structure and the critique of that structure's codependence. Necessary codependence. We can't give up this metaphysical complicity without giving up the critique itself. Okay, so then skip over to 281. The opposition is reducing, the opposition is systematic with the reduction. So up until that point, so after what we read there, he basically says the sensible and intelligible is, in order to critique the notion of presence, it has to rely on other metaphysical concepts, like the distinction between the sensible and intelligible. So even in Saussure, right, even as one problematizes certain traditional philosophical premises, you're also stuck with them. And what we are saying here about this sign can be extended to all concepts and all sentences of metaphysics, in particular discourse on structure. But there are several ways of being caught in this circle. They are all more or less naive, more or less empirical, more or less systematic, more or less close to the formulation of this circle. It is these differences which explain the multiplicity of destructive discourses and the disagreement between those who elaborate them. Nietzsche, Freud, and Heidegger, for example, worked with the inherited concepts of metaphysics. Since these concepts aren't element or atoms, and since they are taken from a system, every particular borrowing brings with it the whole of metaphysics. This is what allows these destroyers to destroy each other in turn. Heidegger regarding Nietzsche with as much lucidity and rigor as bad faith and misconstruction as the last metaphysician. Or one could do the same to Heidegger, or Freud, or a number of others. And today, no exercise is more widespread. Right, what does that say? That paragraph. I'll give you a clue. It doesn't say nothing.
Well, because every single critique of metaphysics carries metaphysics with it, then every single critique of metaphysics is then subject to the same kind of critique as the critique that it is.
It's the easiest thing in the world to say, this critique of metaphysics still retains its metaphysical premises. I mean, this critique of patriarchy still is, stuck in patriarchy. It's an interminable, it's structurally impossible not to do those things. And so basically it's like there are different ways of being caught in the circle, and it's precisely because there are different ways of being caught in the circle that one can be like, your way's stupid, right? And this is a better way to go. But what he's pointing to is simply, this is what enables the movement of critique itself, is because you can always find a way in which a discourse is complicit with the very thing that it is attempting to critique. Now, it's unclear when he says no practice is more widespread, if he's rolling his eyes at that, or if he's saying that's the only game in town. Because what we will see, I mean, he will then proceed to do that in the rest of this essay. And so, in his reading of Levi-Strauss, he's going to now turn to, you know, what is the function of this problematic when it plays out in the social sciences? Well, let's look at Levi-Strauss. And by the way, let's look at Levi-Strauss because he's like a really smart guy. He's an exceptionally good incarnation of this problematic. And let's look at the way that he tries to deal with this. And in effect, we're going to say, like, look, his attempt to deal with this is one attempt to deal with this. And to his credit, he's aware of having to negotiate this problematic, more so than lots of anthropologists that are just out there, like, whatever, doing their anthropological studies. He's aware of the way in which the structure of how he does his work is implicated in a much larger problematic. So good for him on that. But nevertheless, it seems like the way he's doing it is not the most interesting way of inhabiting the circle. So if that's the sad, nostalgic side, there's a sad or nostalgic element of the loss of center for Levi-Strauss that doesn't have to be there. It isn't necessary, perhaps. But let's move through. So okay. So what Levi-Strauss offers us, or what he's a symptom of here, is the moment in the history of the West when something like anthropology has to begin to question the status of Western knowledge. Right? So, in other words, what an anthropologist does is it goes to indigenous cultures and it studies them, right? What's different about the unique circle that Levi-Strauss, as a result of the problematic, has begun to realize is that the West, or Western conceptions of knowledge, can no longer consider themselves the center, right? They must recognize that they are at stake in the game. In other words, this is a self-conscious anthropology, right? Levi-Strauss, I mean, go read Levi-Strauss. Like, if you read Levi-Strauss, I remember, so I read this Derrida essay, I was like, yeah, beat up that Levi-Strauss guy. And then I went and read Levi-Strauss, I was like, damn, this guy's smart. Like, now I'm going to have to go back and reread Derrida, because I thought this guy was saying what that guy.
It's the thing about this diagram about birds, cattle, and horses or something. Like where it sets up the structure of how we deal with things that are like us but not like us, things that exist with us, but it's just...
Well, it's an attempt to self-consciously reflect on what happens the moment where, here's your field studies other cultures. You cannot presume that your mode of knowing is in any way superior. In other words, these people are different than you. How can you take them on their own terms? That's the challenge. In other words, this would be, in our terms today, you would say that this is like a post-colonial orientation, right? So it's trying to look at things from the point of view of the other and not presume one's ways of knowing to be the absent and unquestioned center, right? Our epistemology, our ways of knowing are itself problematic. But we can't just get outside of them. That's exactly the problem that one is faced with here. One recognizes the limits or problems with one's epistemological orientation, but one can't give it up. Let's take the example. This is the incest example. Okay? So, what does the incest example do for Levi-Strauss? What does incest do for Levi-Strauss?
So a blurring between the prior distinction of nature and culture, because it seems to be both.
Right, so I mean, the argument is very straightforward, which is, if you're studying culture, your whole area of study is premised on a distinction between nature and culture. There's no way around that. How do you pick which things you look at? Well, it's the stuff that's not nature, right? Like, I mean, there's no way around that. So your whole field is articulated. Now, I would say the same thing for literary stuff. I mean, we're all like that, you know. But your whole field is articulated based on this really clear binary opposition between nature and culture. And you look at something like incest. And incest, it is an interdiction. It is this, you can't do this. So there's the culture part, but it's universal. Every culture has it. There's the nature part. Shit, scandal, right? Is the incest prohibition natural or cultural? So at this moment, someone like Levi-Strauss goes, okay. What this shows us, of course, is not that incest is weird, it's that our categories of nature and culture are wrong. Right? They are not adequate to the task. This is where, like, just to give you an example, for me, and this is always concerning to me, and oddly not to anybody else, but you know, like every year they have to change the clock like a microsecond or something so that it keeps up with, do you know what that means? Our sense of time is absolutely wrong, right? It is 100% wrong. Like, it's inaccurate in terms of how the universe functions. Even if it's just a micromillisecond, it means it's absolutely wrong. So now, can we get along and function perfectly well with being wrong? Of course we can. We always have and we will continue to. But it's a little bit fucked up, you know? But that's what the nature of culture, that's what the incest prohibition does, is it indicates a rupture in what has seemed to be a kind of seamless conceptual architecture of nature versus culture. So it's one of those moments, and again, it's only one moment. Incest prohibition is just one thing. But just like that millisecond of time, that one thing shows you that these categories don't work. These categories are not adequate to what you're trying to do. So then the question for Derrida is, okay, Levi-Strauss starts with this. That's cool, right? He starts his discourse with incest taboo. He starts with the limit of nature culture. He's starting with the problem with Western epistemology, or axiology in this case. And that's where he begins. Now, what do you do? So at this point,